She had been his secret for 5 years, not a rumor, not a suspicion. A secret, the kind that lives behind locked doors and unlisted phone numbers, the kind that gets its mail sent to a P.O. box and its name kept off every document that matters. Aaliyah Vance had told herself it was love. She had told herself that enough times that it had started to feel like a prayer. And like most prayers spoken in the dark, it had kept her going. Through the winters on that farm, through the mornings when Jedediah Thorne left before sunrise without waking her, through the holidays she spent watching his family's cars roll down the gravel road from a window he didn't know she stood at. She had told herself it was love. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, a man in a gray suit drove a black sedan through the front gate of the Thorne homestead, walked up the porch steps with a leather briefcase, and said 4 words that unraveled 5 years in under a minute. Sign. Right. Now. He was not talking to Jed. He was talking to her. Aaliyah stood in the kitchen in the clothes she'd slept in, a coffee mug in her hand, steam still rising from it, and she looked at the document he had placed on the kitchen table, the table she had eaten at, wept at, written letters at, and prayed at for 5 years, and she read the heading at the top of the page, Deed of Voluntary Transfer, Oakhaven County, Alabama. Her name was on it, her name, and a piece of land she had never heard Jed mention. Land that, according to the attorney now tapping the paper with a manicured finger, had been placed in her name 18 months ago without her knowledge, without her signature, without her consent. Mrs. Vance, the attorney said, the estate requires your immediate cooperation. There is a probate hearing scheduled for Friday. If you do not sign this voluntary transfer today, you will be named as a contested party and summoned to appear. Aaliyah set the coffee mug down on the counter. She set it down slowly, deliberately, the way a woman sets something down when she is buying herself a breath before she has to speak. I didn't sign anything, she said. I have never signed anything. The attorney opened the briefcase, removed a second document, slid it across the table. There was her signature, notarized, dated 14 months ago. Aaliyah Vance looked at that signature for a long time. She knew her own handwriting. She had written it 10,000 times. On birthday cards, on rent checks, on the letters she had written to her mother in Georgia before her mother passed. That was not her handwriting. That was someone else's version of her name. And that, right there, is where this story truly begins. Not with love, not with the farm, not even with the money. It begins with a woman standing in a kitchen she had poured herself into for 5 years, holding evidence that someone had used her name while she was busy believing in them. The question now was not whether she had been lied to. The question was how deep the lie went, how many people had built a structure around her without her knowing, and whether the man she had loved, really loved, with the particular vulnerability of a woman who had already lost too much, had put his hands on that structure himself. Was she a woman who had been loved imperfectly? Or was she a woman who had been used deliberately? Was the farm the reason he had kept her close? Or had the farm simply been the thing that made it possible to keep her hidden? And the deepest question, the one that would chase her through every room of the next weeks of her life, was this: how do you rebuild yourself when the ground you were standing on was never yours to begin with? If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe now, hit like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Keep watching until the very end, because at minute 15, you'll get a major reveal. To understand what happened at that kitchen table, you have to understand what Oakhaven was. You have to understand what the Thorne name meant in that county, what it had meant for 100 years. The Thorne homestead sat on 312 acres of red Alabama clay and old-growth oak, 7 miles south of Oakhaven proper, at the end of a private gravel road that was technically a county road, but that everyone in the county treated as Thorne property. Because it was. Because everything in that part of Oakhaven had been Thorne property in one form or another since before the Civil War, and the kind of deference that accumulates over that many generations does not disappear just because the century changes. Jedediah Thorne, Jed, to people who knew him, which was fewer than he imagined, was 62 years old. He was the kind of man who filled a room without trying to. Tall, deliberate, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more complicated, authority with a scar on it. He had run the homestead for 30 years, since his father, Henry Thorne, died of a stroke in the East Field on a September afternoon, the riding mower still running beside him when they found him. Jed had never fully recovered from that. No one who knew him well said so out loud, but the farm bore the mark of it. The East Field had never been planted the same way again. Jed had rerouted the irrigation, replaced the fencing, and let a line of pines grow up along that boundary like a curtain he didn't want pulled back. He had been married once. Eleanor Thorne, née Marsh, was the kind of woman Oakhaven approved of. Local family, old money, quiet manner, impeccable at church fundraisers and 4th of July barbecues. Eleanor had given him 4 children and had died of ovarian cancer 11 years before this story begins, in the big bedroom at the top of the stairs, looking out at the oaks she had always loved. Jed had grieved her. He had grieved her in the particular way of men who don't know how to speak their grief and so let it calcify, into silence, into work, into distance from his children, and eventually, though he never named it that way, into Aaliyah. Aaliyah Vance had come to Oakhaven 5 years before this October morning. She had come from Mobile, Alabama, originally the daughter of a schoolteacher and a mechanic who had raised her to be self-sufficient, which she was, and to trust carefully, which she had tried to be but wasn't always. She was 51 years old. She was elegant in the way of a woman who has had to work for everything she owns and therefore treats her possessions, her coat, her shoes, her word, with a kind of reverence. She had come to Oakhaven to help her late mother's estate. Her mother had rented a small house on the edge of town from a property management company that turned out, upon closer inspection, to be managed by Thorne Agricultural Holdings. That was how she had first met Jed, at a property dispute mediation at the county clerk's office on a Wednesday morning, where she had shown up with a manila folder and the firm, clear diction of a woman who was not going to be dismissed. Jed had looked at her across a conference table and said something she would think about for a long time afterward. He had said, "You are the first person who has ever walked into this office and made me feel like I should have prepared better." It was not a flirtation. Not exactly. It was recognition. And that, recognition, was the thing Aaliyah had been hungry for longer than she could say. The relationship that developed was slow, private, and deeply complicated by everything that surrounded it. Jed was widowed. He was not hiding a wife, but he was hiding something, a complexity of family structure and financial obligation and a county's worth of expectations that he had never quite found the words to explain to her, and that she had never quite found the courage to fully demand. She had moved to the homestead 18 months after they met, not officially, not with her name on any document. She lived in the East Wing, the older part of the house, the part that had been staff quarters a century ago, and that Jed had renovated quietly into something private and comfortable. She managed the household. She supervised the small staff of 3. She kept the books for the domestic accounts, not the farm accounts. That distinction had always been there, clear and uncrossed. She had told herself this was transitional. She had told herself for 5 years that transitional was a reasonable place to be. Now there was a man at her kitchen table with a forged signature and a deed, and the clock on the probate court was already running. Oakhaven County Probate Court had received a petition 3 weeks prior, filed by Mabel Sterling, Jed's older sister by 2 years, and the woman who had sat quietly at every Thorne family gathering for 30 years, eating her peach cobbler, saying very little, and watching everything. The petition concerned the eastern parcel, 47 acres that ran along the county road and bordered the irrigation channel. It was, in the language of the filing, improperly transferred from the Thorne estate to a non-family third party without full disclosure to rightful heirs. Aaliyah was the non-family third party. The transfer had happened. She now understood, standing in the kitchen with the document in front of her, because Jed had put the land in her name, without telling her, without asking. A quiet deed transfer, notarized by a man whose name she did not recognize, at an address in a town 20 miles east of Oakhaven. The question that followed her out of the kitchen and onto the back porch that morning, where the October air was cool and the oaks were turning rust and gold, was this: had Jed done it to protect her? Or had he done it for a reason she had not yet found? Because there was a second piece she had noticed in the document. A clause, small, in the lower half of the second page, the kind of clause that attorneys put where they hope people won't read. If the voluntary transfer was completed, the eastern parcel would revert to the Thorne estate in full. But there was a condition attached, a condition that named not just the land, but a trust instrument, the Eleanor Thorne Memorial Trust, and a beneficiary designation that had been modified to include her name. Aaliyah Vance sat on the porch swing, the chains creaking once in the wind, and understood that she was standing at the center of something that had been constructed around her for a very long time. Someone had built walls she hadn't seen, drawn maps she hadn't been given, and placed her on a board without telling her what game was being played. The attorney was still inside. Jed was not at the homestead. He had left 2 days ago for Birmingham. A routine trip, he had said. Business. He would be back Friday. Friday was the probate hearing. The clock was already running. She did not sign. She stood at the porch door, pushed it open, walked back into the kitchen, and said to the attorney, whose name was Gerald Finch, of Finch and Associates in Oakhaven, an office she had seen but never entered, "I will not be signing anything today." Finch did not react the way a man reacts when he expects to be refused. He reacted the way a man reacts when he expected exactly this and had a response already prepared. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice modulating into something that was almost avuncular, "I want to be straightforward with you. The estate is under considerable financial pressure. There are liens on 2 of the northern parcels. The farm operating account is behind on its quarterly property tax installments. A contested probate proceeding will take months and will cost, I want to be honest, it will cost more than the eastern parcel is worth in isolation." He paused. "The family is not looking to harm you. They are looking to protect a legacy that has been in this county for 100 years. Aaliyah looked at him. "And who," she said, "is the family?" Finch straightened his briefcase clasp. "The Thorne siblings, Mabel Sterling, as executor of the estate's petition, and the 4 children, Calloway, Iris, Nate, and June." The 4 names dropped into the kitchen like stones into still water. She knew those names. She had lived in this house for 5 years, and she knew those names the way you know the names of people who have never once acknowledged your existence. By heart, in the dark, with a specific kind of quiet ache. Calloway, the oldest, 38, who ran the farm's commercial operations and who had looked through her at Thanksgiving 3 years ago as though she were a window rather than a person. Iris, 36, fierce, a graduate of Howard University who now worked as a civil rights attorney in Montgomery, and who had once, at a family dinner Aaliyah had accidentally walked through, said in a voice low, but not low enough, "I don't understand what his arrangement is with that woman, but I intend to find out." Nate, 33, who had left Oakhaven at 20 and spent the better part of the decade drifting between jobs and cities, who came home at Christmas with a quiet sadness around him and left again before New Year's. And June, 29, the youngest, who had Jed's eyes and Eleanor's gentleness, who had once brought Aaliyah a cup of tea without being asked during a thunderstorm when the power went out, and who was the only one of the 4 who had ever treated her like a person standing in a room. Finch gathered his documents. He left his card. He left through the front door, and the sound of his black sedan on the gravel was the sound of a clock starting. Aaliyah stood in the kitchen for a long time after he was gone. Then she went to the room she kept her things in, the east wing bedroom with the narrow window that looked out over the irrigation channel, and she pulled from the back of her closet a fireproof document box, steel gray, with a combination lock whose combination she had changed the month she moved in. She opened it. Inside, her birth certificate, her social security card, the lease agreement from Mobile, her mother's death certificate, a copy of every check she had ever written from the household account, and at the bottom, in a plain manila envelope, every letter Jed had ever written her. She lifted the envelope and held it in both hands. She did not open it. She set it back in the box, closed the lid, and dialed a number she had kept in her phone for 2 years without ever using. The number of a woman named Corinne Marsh, no relation to Eleanor, different Marshes entirely, who was a paralegal at a small legal aid office in Mobile, and who had 2 years ago at a church fundraiser in Oakhaven, pressed her card into Aaliyah's hand and said quietly, "If you ever need someone on your side, call me. Don't wait until you're desperate." The phone rang twice. Corinne answered. "I think," Aaliyah said, "I waited until I was desperate." Corinne Marsh was 44 years old, small and precise in the manner of a woman who has spent her career in rooms where the powerful people have all the furniture and she has to stand. She drove up from Mobile the next morning in a battered silver Honda, arrived at the homestead at 8 a.m., and sat at the kitchen table where the attorney had sat the day before and said nothing for 3 full minutes while she read the documents Aaliyah had laid out. Then she said, "The notarization on the second signature page is from a notary whose commission expired 8 months before the document was dated." Aaliyah had been standing at the counter with coffee. She turned around. "That means the notarization is invalid," Corinne said, "which means the signature page, your signature, cannot be legally certified, which means if this deed transfer was ever challenged, the chain of title is broken." She looked up from the documents. "Someone made a mistake," she said, "or someone was in a hurry." This was the first true breath Aaliyah had taken in 24 hours. But Corinne was not finished. She set the documents down and folded her hands and said, in the careful way of someone who respects the person she is speaking to enough to give them the full picture, "Here is what I need you to understand. The notarization defect gives us a legal tool, but it doesn't change the political reality of what is happening. Mabel Sterling filed this probate petition because she found something, or because someone told her something, or because she has been waiting for the right moment for a long time, and that moment arrived. Finding the defect helps us in court. But the battle is not only in court." Aaliyah sat down across from her. "What is the battle?" she asked. Corinne looked at her steadily. "The battle is about what Jed knew, what he intended, and what he is willing to say out loud, publicly, before Friday." The name landed between them. Jed. Aaliyah had not heard from him in 48 hours. He had not called, had not texted. His phone went to voicemail, and she had not left one because she did not yet know what to say in a voicemail to a man whose motivation she was beginning to question from the ground up. "There is something else," Aaliyah said. She took out the second document, the one with the Eleanor Thorne Memorial Trust Clause. She placed it on the table and pointed to the beneficiary modification. Corinne read it. She was quiet for a moment. "This trust was established 11 years ago," she said, "after Eleanor died. If the beneficiary designation was modified to include you, that modification required Jed's signature as trustee. It also required the signature of a co-trustee." She looked at the document. "The co-trustee listed here is Mabel Sterling." The two women looked at each other. "Mabel signed the trust modification," Aaliyah said slowly, "which means Mabel knew her name was in that trust. Which means," Corinne said, "Mabel knew exactly what she was filing against." The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. The October wind moved through the oaks outside, and Aaliyah understood for the first time that this was not simply a family trying to protect land from an outsider. This was something else. This was a family, or part of it, protecting something from itself, and she had been placed, without her knowledge, at the center of the thing being protected. She did not yet know why, but the clock on Friday's hearing was now 72 hours away, and the question of who in this family was a weapon and who was a shield had just become the most important question she had ever needed to answer. Calloway Thorne arrived at the homestead that afternoon. He did not knock. He had a key. Of course he had a key. This was his father's house. And he came through the side door that opened into the mudroom, and Aaliyah heard his boots on the tile and came out of the kitchen, and they stood in the hallway, looking at each other. He was her height, dark-skinned like his father, with his mother's jaw, and a set to his eyes that was neither cruel nor warm. It was calculated. He ran the farm the way an engineer runs a system, efficiently, with very little interest in what the individual components felt about their function. "I know Finch came," he said. "He did," she said. "I need you to understand something," Calloway said. He was not asking her to sit down. He was not offering anything. Not coffee, not civility, not even the fiction of it. The Eastern Parcel has a lien against it, a private lien from an investment group out of Birmingham. That lien was placed 18 months ago as collateral for a loan that the farm needed to survive a bad season. The deed transfer, your name on that parcel, was used to confuse the lien's priority claim. If probate drags this out, the lien holder can accelerate their note and demand immediate repayment. That would cost this farm $320,000 that does not exist in the operating account. He said all of that the way a man reads numbers from a spreadsheet. No warmth, no apology. Your father, Aaliyah said, did all of that without telling me. Yes, Calloway said. He did, and I need you to understand that this is not a personal matter. This is a financial matter. The family needs the deed corrected before Friday, or we lose collateral on the lien, and the whole eastern section goes to a receivership process that takes years and costs more than any of us have. Aaliyah looked at him for a long moment. Calloway, she said, the notarization on my supposed signature is from an expired commission. He blinked once. Something shifted behind his eyes. Which means, she continued, keeping her voice very level, that I did not sign anything. Which means someone signed for me, and that is fraud. The hallway went very quiet. Calloway Thorne, the pragmatist, the man who ran the farm like a machine and had looked through her like a window for 5 years. That man stood in the hallway, and for the first time she saw something that looked almost like fear move across his face. Not fear of her, fear of what he had just learned. Finch notarized it? He said. No, she said. Someone else. A notary whose commission expired 8 months before the date on the document. Calloway pulled out his phone. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. Who else knows about the commission date? My paralegal, she said. Corinne's word. Her paralegal. She used it deliberately. Calloway was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, Don't do anything before I make a call. He went back out the side door. Aaliyah stood in the hallway alone. The helpful person, she thought, the dutiful, competent, calculating firstborn who had managed this farm and managed this family and managed to never once acknowledge her existence, had just looked frightened. And the woman everyone had spent 5 years treating as invisible had just shown him something he hadn't known was there. The first reversal had arrived. It had arrived quietly, in a hallway, without fanfare. The fragile, the overlooked, the hidden, she had shown steal. And the farm's firstborn had gone outside to make a call. Iris Thorne called at 9 that evening. Aaliyah was sitting at the East Wing desk, going through the household account records she had kept for 5 years. Every expense, every payment, every transfer, logged by hand in the composition books she bought at the dollar store in Oakhaven and kept in the document box. She was building a timeline. She was doing it the only way she knew how, methodically, quietly, one entry at a time. The phone buzzed. The name on the screen was simply Iris T. Because when you live in someone's house and their children's numbers are in the household contact sheet, you end up with their names in your phone whether you want them there or not. She answered. Ms. Vance. Iris's voice was sharp, precise, the voice of a woman who had argued in front of judges and did not soften it for kitchen conversation. I've spoken with Calloway. I need to understand what you know about the Eleanor Thorne Memorial Trust. Good evening, Aaliyah said. A pause. Iris recalibrated slightly. Good evening. I apologize for the hour. What do you want to know? I want to know, Iris said, when you first became aware that your name was in the trust modification. Yesterday morning, Aaliyah said, when the attorney brought the deed. I saw the clause on page 2. I had never seen that document before. I had never signed it. And I have reason to believe the signature bearing my name is fraudulent. Another pause. Longer this time. Do you know, Iris said carefully, that the trust modification was co-signed by my Aunt Mabel? I do now, Aaliyah said. The silence on the line was different after that. It was the silence of an attorney recalculating a situation she had thought she understood. Ms. Vance, Iris said finally, and her voice had dropped half a register, still sharp, but underneath it now, something that was almost human, almost raw. Almost the voice of a daughter who was 36 years old and had been trying to understand her father's choices for the better part of her adult life. I owe you an apology. Aaliyah did not say anything. I have treated you as a problem to be solved for 5 years, Iris said. I have treated your presence in this house as an inconvenience and a complication. I have not asked who you are. I have not asked what your experience has been. I have been focused on what this situation meant for my family without thinking about what it meant for you. Aaliyah took a slow breath. I appreciate you saying that, she said. I'm not saying it to be gracious, Iris said. I'm saying it because I think what happened to you is more complicated than I understood. And I think the person I need to talk to, honestly, not legally, is you. They talked for 2 hours. What Iris told her in that conversation rearranged several pieces of the picture Aaliyah had been assembling. The Eleanor Thorne Memorial Trust had been established with the stated purpose of preserving the homestead for the next generation. The trust held the deed to the main house and the surrounding 40 acres. The income from the farm flowed into the trust annually and was distributed to the 4 children through a formula Eleanor had designed, a formula that Mabel Sterling had been helping to administer since the beginning, because Mabel was meticulous with paperwork and Jed, for all his authority on the land, was not. 18 months ago, the same period when the eastern parcel deed had been transferred, Jed had made changes to the trust. He had added a survivor clause, a provision stating that in the event of his death or incapacity, a named co-trustee would assume administrative control until a full probate review was completed. The co-trustee named was not Mabel. The co-trustee named was Aaliyah Vance. Iris had found this 2 days ago, going through her father's files while he was in Birmingham. She had not told Calloway the full scope of it. She had hired her own attorney, separately, quietly, to review the instrument. "He named you as co-trustee," Iris said, and the weight in her voice was not accusation. It was confusion, and under the confusion, grief. "That means in the event anything happened to him, you would have had administrative control over the trust that holds this house, over the asset that represents 30 years of our family's life." And my aunt, who has been quietly managing the trust paperwork for a decade, found that modification and filed the probate petition the same week. Aaliyah sat very still. "He was trying to protect me," she said, slowly, carefully, testing the sentence. "Or," Iris said, and the attorney in her did not soften this, "he was trying to protect something he was afraid Mabel would eventually take, and he used you as the mechanism without telling you what you were carrying." The desk lamp buzzed faintly. Outside, the porch swing moved in the wind. Aaliyah looked at the composition books in front of her. 5 years of domestic accounts, 5 years of household records, 5 years of a life lived in the margins of another person's legacy. And she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was the precise and terrible combination of both. She had not been loved carelessly. She had been used carefully. And the distance between those two things was the distance between a human being and an instrument. There was one more thing Iris told her before they hung up. Iris had spoken to Nate, the ghost, the 3rd child, the one who had left and drifted and come back hollow-eyed every Christmas, had told Iris something that neither of them had known. Nate had been present at the notarization, not as a witness to Aaliyah's signature, as a witness to the fact that the notarization had been conducted by a notary named Darnell Webb, a man Nate knew from a summer job 20 years ago, a man who had done small-scale document work for various Oakhaven families over the years, and who had, Nate now believed, allowed his commission to lapse without informing anyone who was using his services. Nate had not known this at the time. He had been present because Mabel had asked him to drive the documents to Webb's address in the small town of Calverton on a Tuesday afternoon, and had told him only that it was routine estate paperwork. He had been used too, the ghost, the quiet one, the son who had spent a decade running from this family's weight. He had been a hand on a board without knowing what pieces he was moving. That knowledge had been eating him since Iris called him 2 days ago. The next morning, before Aaliyah could call him, there was a knock at the east wing door. She opened it. Nate Thorne stood on the step, 33 years old, thinner than his frame suggested he should be, with his father's height and his mother's coloring, Eleanor's pale honey skin and dark eyes, and the look of a man who had been sitting with something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to set it down, even though he wasn't sure where the ground was. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Come in," she said. He sat at the east wing desk. She sat on the edge of the bed, the narrow iron frame bed she had bought herself, with the quilt she had made from her mother's fabric scraps, and she let him speak without interrupting him. He told her about Calverton, about Mabel's errand, about Darnell Webb's address and the manila envelope he had carried in the passenger seat of his truck, sealed, the way you carry sealed things when someone has told you not to open them. He told her that he had suspected afterward that something was off, that the errand had felt wrong the way some things feel wrong when you're too close to the people involved to name the wrongness. He told her that he had spent the better part of a decade leaving this place and this family because something about it had always felt constructed, like the happiness was load-bearing and the grief was structural, and if you asked too many questions, the whole thing would come down. He told her, finally quietly, that he was sorry, not for what he had done, because he hadn't known, but for the atmosphere that had made it possible, for the years of invisibility, for the dinners and the holidays and the way his family had arranged themselves around her presence without ever making room for her. Aaliyah listened to all of it. When he was done, she said, "I'm not angry at you, Nate." He looked at the floor. "You were used the same way I was," she said. "The difference is, you got to leave. I stayed because I believed in something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you still?" It was a real question, not a rhetorical one, not a gentle one. A real question, asked by a man who had spent his adult life not trusting his own ability to read love, asking a woman he had never properly seen whether 5 years of difficult, complicated, imperfect feeling had been real. Aaliyah thought about it. "I believe he cared," she said finally. "I don't yet know what he was trying to do. Those are two different things, and I need to know the second one before I can properly hold the first one." Nate nodded. Something in him settled slightly. Not resolved, but settled, the way a room settles when a window is cracked and fresh air comes through. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need a witness," she said. "Someone who can say, in writing, what they were asked to do, by whom and when. A statement, signed." He did not hesitate. "I'll do it," he said. And that, the ghost, the one who had been running, was the first person to stand publicly with her. Before the attorneys, before the courtroom, before the Friday hearing, that was now less than 48 hours away. The clock was pressing now, but she was no longer alone in the room. June came on Thursday. She did not call ahead. She arrived in her small white car just after noon, parked on the side of the gravel drive rather than in front, as though she were not sure she had the right to take the center space, and she knocked at the front door rather than using the key she presumably had. Aaliyah opened the door and looked at her. June Thorne was 29, and she was the one in this family Aaliyah had always felt the most complicated tenderness toward, because June was gentle in a way that this household had not protected, and she had the particular fragility of a person who has been soft in a hard place for too long. She was carrying something in her arms, a casserole dish covered in foil, slightly warm. "I didn't know what else to bring," she said. Aaliyah stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. They sat at the kitchen table. June had made sweet potato casserole. Eleanor Thorne's recipe, which everyone in Oak Haven knew, was the recipe Eleanor had brought from her mother's house in Birmingham, and which the church auxiliary still made every year at the Christmas fundraiser in her memory. June had made it because she didn't know what else to do, and she was a person who, when frightened, cooked. She said with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the table, "I want you to know that I don't agree with any of this. I want you to know that I told Calloway that." "I know," Aaliyah said, "and I want you to know something in return." June looked up. "I have never wanted anything that belonged to this family," Aaliyah said. "I was not in this house for the land or the trust or the money. I was here because your father made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like my presence in a room was something worth accounting for. I want you to believe that." June's eyes filled. "I do," she said. "I've always believed that." "Then I need you to do something for me," Aaliyah said. "I need you to tell me what you know about Mabel." June was quiet. "Mabel," she said, and something careful crossed her face, the careful look of a person choosing words near something sharp. "Mabel has been managing the trust paperwork since before Daddy was fully in control of it. She was the one who kept the books when Grandpa Henry was sick. She has always believed, I think genuinely believed, that the homestead should stay in the family bloodline. She said it at the table 100 times. This land was bought with Thorne blood, and it belongs to Thorne children." She paused. "She never said it to you directly," June said, "but she always said it when you could hear." Aaliyah nodded. She had heard. She had catalogued every instance of it with the precise memory of a woman who understood that words said near her, but not to her, were a specific category of cruelty. "When Daddy put your name in the trust," June continued, "Mabel found out because she still had counter-signature access to the trust account. She receives copies of all amendments. It's in the original trust instrument. She would have received a notification. And she filed the probate petition within days," Aaliyah said. "Within a week," June said. "I found the filing date." They sat with that for a moment. "June," Aaliyah said, Were you aware of the lien on the eastern parcel? June shook her head. Calloway handles the farm finances. He doesn't tell us much. I knew there had been a bad season 2 years ago. I knew Daddy had been stressed about money. But the details, she shook her head again. Calloway kept all of that very close. There was a sound from outside. Tires on gravel. Both women turned toward the front window. A black SUV, Calloway's truck, and behind it, a second vehicle. A car Aaliyah did not recognize. A dark sedan with county plates. June stood up. Her face had gone pale. That's not just Calloway, she said. Aaliyah stood. Through the window she could see Calloway getting out of his truck. He was speaking to someone in the sedan. The door of the sedan opened, and the person who stepped out was Mabel Sterling. Mabel, who was 64 years old, who wore her silver hair pressed and pinned, who dressed in the clothes of a woman who had attended too many funerals and took comfort in being appropriately attired. Navy, gray, pearl buttons, sensible heels, who carried herself with the particular dignity of a person who has managed other people's most difficult business for so long that they have begun to feel that the business is theirs. She walked toward the front door. Calloway walked beside her. The illusion of the safe afternoon in the kitchen, the sweet potato casserole, the quiet and tentative connection, it broke. The porch step creaked, then the knock. Aaliyah opened the door. Mabel Sterling looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been arranging this moment for a long time and intends to conduct it properly. Aaliyah, she said. No title. Just the first name, used the way a person uses a first name when they want to establish that there is no formality owed. Mabel, Aaliyah said. May we come in? No, Aaliyah said. It was the quietest possible word, delivered without heat, without apology, without the apologetic softening that the word sometimes gets. She simply said no, the way a woman says no when she has decided that her threshold means something. Mabel blinked. Once. Calloway shifted slightly. The hearing is tomorrow morning, Mabel said. There are things we should discuss before it reaches a courtroom. If you want to discuss them, Aaliyah said, you can call the attorney whose card I'm going to give you. Her name is Corinne Marsh. She's currently consulting with a probate specialist in Mobile. They are available to speak with your counsel tomorrow morning before the 10 o'clock hearing. She handed Mabel the card. She handed it the way you hand someone a card when you have decided that the conversation is structured from now on. Mabel looked at the card. She looked at it for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she looked back at Aaliyah. And here was the thing about Mabel Sterling that the town of Oakhaven had never quite named, because to name it would have required a kind of honesty about the dynamics of this family that was more painful than comfortable. But that Aaliyah, standing at the door, now saw clearly. Mabel was afraid. Not of Aaliyah. Not specifically. She was afraid of the document she had co-signed. She was afraid of what Nate had apparently told Iris. She was afraid of the notarization defect she had either not known about or hoped no one would find. She was afraid, most fundamentally, of what Jed had put in that trust. Not because it threatened her financially, but because it threatened the story of the Thorne family, the story in which she was the keeper, the protector, the one who had managed and maintained and ensured that the Thorne name in Oakhaven County continued to mean what it meant. Adding Aaliyah Vance to that story, not as a hidden appendage, but as a named co-trustee, a person with standing and authority and acclaim, changed the story in a way Mabel could not accept. It was not money. It was identity. It was the particular terror of a woman who has made a life of being indispensable to a structure, realizing that the structure was being redesigned without her. Calloway said from behind his aunt, Aaliyah, I need you to understand that if this goes to a full hearing, the financial exposure— Calloway, Aaliyah said, I understand the financial exposure. I've been keeping the household accounts for 5 years. I know what's in the operating account. I know when the property tax payments are late. I know about the lien, and I know about the Birmingham Investment Group, and I know that the deed transfer was used as collateral manipulation. I know all of that. He was very still. What I did not know, she said, was that any of it was being done in my name, without my knowledge, without my consent, and that is a problem that is not solved by me signing something on a kitchen table under pressure. She looked at both of them. I will see you in court tomorrow, she said. She closed the door. She stood behind it for a moment, her hand on the old brass knob, and she heard their footsteps on the porch, the gravel, the cars. She heard Mabel say something to Calloway, low and tight, the particular tone of a woman recalibrating. June was behind her in the hallway. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen," June said. Aaliyah turned around. "It was the only thing I had," she said, "so it had to be brave." She did not sleep that night. Not fully. She lay on the iron frame bed with the quilt pulled up and the lamplight off and the October dark pressing against the narrow window. And she went through the hearing in her mind the way athletes go through the race. Every step, every turn, every possible obstacle. Corinne had arrived at 9 that evening with the probate specialist, a man named Arthur Webb, no relation to the notary, different Webbs, who was compact and gray-haired and who had spent 30 years in Alabama probate courts and who looked at the documents with the particular calm of someone for whom dead bodies, contested estates, and family warfare were simply the grammar of professional life. He identified 4 items in their favor. First, the notarization defect. Darnell Webb's commission had indeed lapsed. The signature page was unenforceable. Second, Nate's written statement, which Aaliyah had received that afternoon, typed, signed, notarized by a notary Corinne had driven him to in Oakhaven. The statement describing the Calverton errand, the sealed envelope, Mabel's instructions, admissible as a witness statement. Third, the trust modification itself. If the trust modification naming Aaliyah as co-trustee was legitimate, if Jed had signed it before a valid notary, which Arthur was 90% certain he had, because that modification bore a different notary than the deed, then the modification had standing. And standing meant she was not simply a contested third party in the probate hearing. She was a named participant in the instrument being contested. "That changes the hearing significantly," Arthur said over coffee at the kitchen table at 10:30 at night. "The petitioner, Mabel, filed this as a routine deed correction petition. She did not file it anticipating that you would appear with standing in the trust. If you have co-trustee standing, the scope of the hearing expands." "Which means?" Aaliyah asked. "Which means Mabel's attorney will want a continuance, and Mabel, I suspect, will want to negotiate before that hearing opens." The fourth item, the lien itself. The Birmingham Investment Group, a private equity firm called Meridian Asset Partners, had placed the lien with specific covenant terms. Arthur had found the filing in the county records office that afternoon, public record, available to anyone with a computer and enough patience. The covenant stated explicitly that the lien could not be accelerated in the event of a pending probate review unless the review resulted in a judgment against the lien holder's interest, which it hadn't, which meant Calloway's warning about financial exposure had been premature at best and deliberately misleading at worst. "Someone told him to use that as pressure," Arthur said quietly. Aaliyah thought of Mabel's face at the door, the fear in it. "Mabel," she said. "Likely," Arthur said. "Or her attorney, which amounts to the same thing." At midnight, Corinne went to the guest room. Arthur drove to the motel in Oakhaven. Aaliyah sat alone in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall said 12:17. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an Alabama number she did not have in her contacts. She opened it. "It's Jed. I'm in Birmingham. I know what's happening. I'm coming home in the morning. We need to talk before the hearing." She read it 3 times. Then she set the phone down on the table, face down. She did not respond, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood, in the very particular way of a woman who has spent 5 years loving someone in the dark and is now standing in the light asking what the darkness actually contained. She understood that the conversation with Jed Thorne was the most important conversation she would ever have with him, and it could not be had by text at midnight with a hearing in 10 hours. She left the phone on the table. She went to her room. She lay on the bed. The porch swing creaked once in the wind, and at some point before dawn, she slept. The Oakhaven County Courthouse was a white-columned building on the square, built in 1924 and renovated in 1987, surrounded by old magnolias that lost their leaves slowly and with great dignity in October. The probate court convened on the 2nd floor, in a room with tall windows and wooden benches, and the particular smell of old carpet and document storage that is the smell of institutional memory. Aaliyah arrived at 9:15 in a dark wool coat she had owned for 12 years, with a folder of documents under her arm, Corinne on her left and Arthur Webb on her right. She had dressed with care, not performance. Care. The coat was well cut. Her shoes were good leather. Her hair was natural and pulled back simply. She wore her mother's earrings, small gold loops her mother had saved for from her teacher's salary, and worn every Sunday for 30 years. They were not elaborate. They were real. She walked up the courthouse steps in the October morning light, and she did not hurry. Mabel Sterling was already in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was with Gerald Finch and a second attorney, a woman Aaliyah didn't know. Calloway stood slightly to the side, in a sport coat, holding a coffee cup with both hands, not looking at anyone. Iris Thorne was there too, alone. She had driven from Montgomery that morning and had arrived 40 minutes before Aaliyah, according to the text she had sent at 7 a.m. She stood apart from the others, near the window, and when she saw Aaliyah, she gave a single nod, the nod of a peer, of one professional woman acknowledging another in a difficult room. Nate was not in the hallway. He had told Aaliyah he would be there. She was about to check her phone when she heard the elevator, and the doors opened, and Nate came out in a button-down shirt and dark trousers, his hair neat for the first time since she could remember, and behind him, was Jed. Jedediah Thorne walked into that hallway the way he walked everywhere, with the natural authority of a man who owns land and carries it in his posture. But something had changed in the set of his face. He looked, for the first time in Aaliyah's 5 years of knowing him, like a man who had been stripped of the armor he didn't know he was wearing. He looked at her. She looked at him. They held each other's eyes across the length of a courthouse hallway, with the magnolias outside the window and the sound of the elevator doors closing, and Mabel Sterling 15 feet away, recalculating everything. Jed crossed the hallway to her. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the first thing he said. Simple, direct, the way a man says it when he is driven through the night from Birmingham, because he understands that some things cannot be delegated or delayed. "Not here," Aaliyah said, quiet, steady. "After." He nodded. He turned to face the hallway. She turned to face it too. And together, not as a couple, not as a performance, but simply as two people who had made choices that had led to this hallway and were now prepared to answer for them, they walked toward the courtroom doors. Mabel Sterling watched them come. Her face was composed. It was the face of a woman who has not given up but is doing the arithmetic. The courtroom doors opened. The hearing began at 10 o'clock. What happened in that hearing was not dramatic in the way courtroom television prepares you for drama. There was no grandstanding, no surprise witnesses called from the gallery, no document dramatically slid across a judge's bench at the last possible moment. What happened was this. Arthur Webb filed a motion at the opening of the hearing stating that Aaliyah Vance held co-trustee standing in the Eleanor Thorne Memorial Trust as amended, and therefore that the deed correction petition, which sought to remove her from the parcel deed on the grounds of improper transfer, could not be resolved as a simple deed correction without also addressing the trust modification, which had been executed under proper notarization and was legally valid. Gerald Finch objected. The probate judge, a woman named Judge Carol Haynes, 55 years old, gray-haired, who had sat in this courtroom for 16 years and whose expression suggested she had seen every variant of family warfare that Alabama could produce, sustained the motion. Finch requested a continuance. Judge Haynes set a continuation hearing for 30 days out and ordered both parties to submit full trust and deed documentation within 14 days. She also, and this was the moment that made the hallway very quiet when they came back out, issued a preliminary order prohibiting any transfer, signature, or modification of the Eastern parcel deed pending the continuation hearing. The lien could not be accelerated. The deed could not be transferred. Everything was frozen. And then she said one additional thing, looking at the documents before her with the careful expression of a judge who has been doing this long enough to know when something smells wrong. "Counsel, I am noting in the record that the notarization on Exhibit C, the deed transfer document, bears a commission stamp from a notary whose commission is recorded as lapsed in the Alabama Notary Public Database as of 14 months prior to the document date. I am referring this matter to the county attorney's office for review." In the room, that landed quietly. In Mabel Sterling's face, it landed like a stone. Finch leaned over to Mabel and said something low. She nodded once, tightly. Calloway, in the row behind them, put his coffee cup down on the bench railing. The hearing adjourned. In the hallway, Mabel Sterling came to Aaliyah. She came alone, without Finch, without Calloway, without the careful ensemble of legal and familial support. Just a 64-year-old woman in a navy dress and pearl buttons walking across a courthouse hallway on a Friday morning in October. She stopped in front of Aaliyah. They looked at each other. Mabel said, "I would like to speak with you, privately. Not today, when you are ready." Aaliyah said, "I'll let my attorney know." Mabel nodded. She started to turn. Then she stopped. She turned back, and she said, and this was the thing that would stay with Aaliyah long after the hearing, long after the resolution, long after most of the other words of these weeks had faded. She said, "I did not hate you. I want you to know that. I was afraid of what you meant. That is different from hatred. It is not better, but it is different." And then she walked away. Aaliyah stood in the hallway with the October light coming through the magnolia windows, and she held that sentence, and she did not reply to it, because there was no reply that honored the complexity of it. Some things you receive. You do not respond to them immediately. You carry them and you think about them, and eventually, in your own time, you decide what they cost and what they clarify. The courthouse clock struck 11. She spoke to Jed that afternoon. They sat on the back porch of the homestead, the same porch she had walked to on Tuesday morning with her coffee mug when the world had been a different shape, and the October air was cool, and the oaks were very golden, and the light on the cotton fields was the particular slant of late autumn that makes everything look like a painting and nothing look like a problem. He told her the truth, all of it. He told her that he had put the land in her name 18 months ago because he had discovered, through his own accountant, that Mabel had been making small, incremental changes to the trust distribution formula over the years. Changes that, compounded over time, would have redirected a significant portion of the trust income away from the children's share and toward a Mabel-controlled administrative account. Not theft, not exactly, but erosion. The slow, careful erosion of a structure by a person who believed she had the right. He had panicked. He had made decisions quickly, without counsel, without transparency, without telling Aaliyah any of it. He had put the eastern parcel in her name as a structural disruption, a way of creating a knot in Mabel's design that couldn't be untied without surfacing the original manipulation. He had named her co-trustee for the same reason. He had done all of it because he was a man who had spent his whole life using the land as his language, and he had tried to use it to protect both the family and her. And he had never once stopped to ask whether she wanted to be protected that way, whether she wanted to be placed in the middle of a family war without her knowledge, whether she had a right to choose. He said all of this. He said, "I thought I was keeping you safe. I was keeping you useful." Those are not the same thing, and I did not see the difference until I was in Birmingham and Iris called me and I understood what I had put you through. Aaliyah looked at the cotton fields. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "You made me a piece of your plan without asking me if I wanted to be in your plan at all." "Yes," he said. "And for 5 years," she said, "I made myself smaller and quieter and more invisible because I believed that patience was how you earned permanence with you. And the whole time, you were doing things in my name." "Yes," he said again, simply, with the particular dignity of a man who has decided that the full truth, spoken plainly, is the only thing he has left to offer. Aaliyah turned and looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, long enough to see the grief in him, not performed grief, not the grief of a man trying to preserve a situation, but the deep, structural grief of a man who has understood something about himself too late and is now living in the aftermath of that understanding. She said, "I loved you. I want you to know that. That was real." He nodded. "But I cannot live in a structure I didn't choose," she said, "not even a structure that was meant to protect me. Because a protection I didn't consent to is still a cage." He was quiet. "I know," he said. "So I need to know," she said, "what you intend to do. Not about Mabel, not about the trust, not about the farm. What you intend to do about us, what this has been and what it is now." Jed Thorne looked out over his land. The land his father had left him, the land he had run for 30 years, the land he had loved and worked and used and protected and sometimes hidden behind. And he said, "I want to build something honest. I don't know if you'll let me. I don't know if I've earned the right to ask, but I want to tell you, in daylight, with my name on it, what you mean to me, and I want to ask you, properly, openly, what you want." The porch swing creaked in the wind. A crow called from the far tree line. Aaliyah said, "That is a different conversation, and I am not ready to have it yet." "I know," he said, "but I am not leaving tonight," she said, "and I am not signing anything." "No," he said, "you shouldn't. Not until you know exactly what everything means." They sat on the porch for a while longer. The light faded. The oaks held their color in the dusk. Inside the house, the refrigerator hummed. The 30 days before the continuation hearing were the longest of Aaliyah's life, and also, in a strange way, the most clarifying. Corinne and Arthur worked with a team of documents. They assembled a full account of the trust modifications Mabel had made over the years, the small administrative adjustments that, taken together, told the story of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the decade since Eleanor's death, that she was the rightful steward of the Thorne legacy and had been acting accordingly. None of it rose to the level of criminal fraud. Most of it was deeply gray, the kind of financial manipulation that lives in the space between careful management and self-serving management, the kind that is technically legal but morally corrosive. The county attorney's office reviewed the notarization referral from Judge Haynes. They determined that Darnell Webb had indeed allowed his commission to lapse and had continued to notarize documents for 18 months after expiration. He cooperated fully, with the particular cooperation of a man who is frightened and remorseful and was not paid nearly enough for the risk he took. He provided a statement. The statement clarified that he had been retained by Gerald Finch's office and had been told the commission expiration was a clerical oversight that had already been reported and would be corrected. Finch's license came under review. Mabel met with Aaliyah's attorneys twice before the continuation hearing. The first meeting was formal and adversarial. The second meeting was different. In the second meeting, Mabel came with a different kind of attorney. Not Finch, who had withdrawn from the case, but a woman named Patricia GANs from Huntsville, who specialized in estate mediation and who had the calm, precise manner of someone committed to resolution rather than combat. In that meeting, Mabel made a proposal. The trust modification naming Aaliyah as co-trustee would stand. In exchange, the eastern parcel, the 47 acres with the lien, would be handled through a formal restructuring agreement in which the lien was refinanced through the farm's operating line of credit, and the parcel was maintained under the trust umbrella with clear governance terms. In exchange for this, Mabel would step down from her countersignature role in the trust, not from the family, not from the property, from the administrative control she had accumulated over a decade. The children, all 4 of them, would become the governing board of the trust, with an independent trustee appointed by the probate court to oversee the first 3 years. Aaliyah's co-trustee status would remain in the trust instrument, dormant, unless Jed Thorne became incapacitated. At that point, it would activate. This was the offer. Corinne and Arthur reviewed it carefully. They identified 3 clauses that needed modification. They submitted those modifications. Mabel's attorney accepted 2 of the 3. The third was negotiated for a further week. On November 19th, 29 days after the first hearing, both parties signed the settlement agreement in the lobby of the probate court. Not in the courtroom. In the lobby. There was no judge, no gallery, just attorneys, documents, and 2 women who had been in a war over a piece of land and a family name, and had found, somewhere in the middle of it, that the war was also about something older and harder to name. When the papers were signed, Mabel looked at Aaliyah across the lobby. She did not say anything. She gave a very small nod, the particular nod of a woman who has not surrendered exactly, but who has arrived at a place she can live with. Aaliyah received it. There are things that were lost. Let me tell you about those, because this story does not end with all the pieces recovered. Gerald Finch lost his license to practice law in Alabama. The Alabama State Bar completed its review 9 months after the county attorney's referral and found that he had knowingly employed a notary whose commission had lapsed on at least 4 separate occasions over 2 years. He moved to Georgia and opened a small title company. The work was quieter, and he was better suited for it. Mabel Sterling stepped back from the trust and from Oak Haven in the way of people who have been central to a structure for so long that removing themselves from the center means, functionally, removing themselves from the room. She moved to Birmingham to be near her daughter. She came to the homestead twice a year, at Christmas and in August, for what would become the annual Thorne family gathering on the back lawn. She sat at the table and she ate, and she asked about the children, and she did not discuss the trust. She was, in the aftermath, a smaller person in the best sense of that. Smaller because she was no longer carrying the weight of a story she had tried to control. She was lighter. She and Aliyah never became friends. They became something more cautious than that, and more honest, and perhaps more durable. They became two women who understood each other. Calloway came to Aliyah's East Wing door 3 months after the settlement, on a Sunday morning when the January light was flat and gray, and said, "I want to apologize for how I spoke to you, for how I conducted myself." Aliyah had said, "I accept that." He had said, "I don't think I'll ever fully understand what my father did, but I think I understand better than I did that the problem wasn't you." She had said, "The problem was that your family made a lot of decisions about me without me, and the solution to that is to stop doing it." He had nodded. He was not transformed. He was still the pragmatist, the man who ran the farm like a system. But he had added a column to the spreadsheet, a column that accounted for whether a person had been asked. Iris became something that surprised Aliyah more than anything else in the aftermath, a colleague. They spoke monthly by phone, about the trust governance, about the farm, eventually about other things. Iris was brilliant and difficult, and occasionally still said things that required Aliyah to set the phone down for a moment before responding. But she was also honest in the way of a woman who has decided that honesty is a professional commitment, and over time that honesty built something between them. Nate came back to the homestead. That was the thing that was unexpected and quiet, and perhaps the most hopeful. Nate came back not to work the farm. He was not built for the farm, and they both knew it, but to work a piece of the land he had negotiated with Calloway, a wooded parcel along the northern boundary, where he built a small studio and made furniture. He had learned woodworking in one of his decade of drifting, and it turned out he was gifted at it. He made things that were simple and solid and precise, and he sold them at the craft market in Oakhaven. And the people of Oakhaven, who had known him as the son who left, gradually became accustomed to him as the son who returned. He and Aliyah ate breakfast together on Tuesday mornings when she was at the homestead at the kitchen table. They did not talk about the family. They talked about other things, the oaks, the weather, a book she was reading, a piece of furniture he was making. The small, nourishing conversations of two people who have been through something difficult together and have chosen to build something ordinary in the aftermath. June got married the following spring to a school teacher from Decatur, a calm and thoughtful man who fit her gentleness the way a good coat fits a person. Aliyah attended the wedding. She sat near the back of the church, not in the family section, by her own choice, in the good wool coat with her mother's earrings. June came back to find her during the reception and said, "I'm glad you're here." Aliyah said, "I wouldn't have missed it." And Jed Thorne was the most complicated piece of the aftermath, and the piece that Aliyah thought about the most in the 2 years that followed, in the way you think about a house you used to live in, not with longing exactly, and not with regret exactly, but with the particular attention of a person who understands that a place shaped them, and is still deciding how to carry that shaping. He had asked her, on the porch in October, to build something honest. She had told him she was not ready. In January, she had moved out of the East Wing. Not dramatically, there was no scene, no thrown things, no slammed doors. She moved her composition books, her document box, her quilt, and her mother's earring case into a house in Oakhaven proper. A small house, rented, on a quiet street with a porch and an old magnolia in the front yard. She paid for it with money she had saved over 5 years of careful, underpaid household management, and it was hers in a way the East Wing had never been. Jed came to see her in February. He stood on her porch. She brought him inside and made coffee. They sat at her kitchen table, in her house, in her town, and she let him speak. He said he had started working with a therapist in Birmingham, a man who specialized in grief and in the particular emotional patterns of men who had learned to use control as a proxy for care. He said he had been doing this for 3 months and that it was, as he put it, like learning a different language at 62, which is harder than it sounds and more necessary than I want to admit. She listened. He said, I don't know what I'm asking for. I'm not asking for what we had. I know that's not what you need. I'm asking if there is a version of something honest between us that I'm permitted to hope for. Aaliyah held her coffee mug in both hands. She thought about 5 years of Tuesday mornings and October light, and a man whose silence had often felt like safety and had turned out to be something more complicated. She thought about her mother's earrings and her composition books and the fireproof document box. She thought about what it meant to have been loved imperfectly by a person who had acted, at his worst, as though she were a means rather than a person, and who was now, at 62, doing the hard work of understanding the difference. She said, I'm not closing the door, but I'm not opening it either. Not yet. That's fair, he said. I want to be seen, she said. Not as a co-trustee, not as a household manager, not as a protective instrument or a legal mechanism. I want to be seen as Aaliyah, as myself, and I need to know that whatever comes next, it comes from that seeing. I understand, he said. I'm not sure you do yet, she said, but I think you're working toward it, and that is different from where we started. He left that afternoon. She sat at her table for a long time after he was gone, in her house, in her town, in the October light. No, it was February now, colder, no oak turning gold, just a gray Alabama winter with the magnolia bare, and she felt something that took her a while to name. She felt like herself, not a protected version of herself, not a hidden version, a useful version, a quietly indispensable version. She felt like the woman who had walked into a county clerk's office with a manila folder and made a man feel like he should have prepared better. She felt like a woman who had survived being used and had not let the using define the using, who had loved and been imperfectly loved and had held on to her own shape through both. She felt, for the first time in years, like she was standing on ground she had chosen. 3 years later, the Eleanor Thorne Memorial Trust received a formal administrative review as part of its new governance structure. The review was conducted by the independent trustee appointed by the probate court and reviewed by all 5 trust participants, Calloway, Iris, Nate, June, and the dormant co-trustee whose name was on the instrument. At the annual trust meeting, held at the homestead in September, the 5 participants sat at the long dining room table, the table Eleanor Thorne had bought at an auction in 1989 and that had held 30 years of family meals, and reviewed the financial statements, the distribution schedule, and the farmland management report. Calloway presented the report. He had added a column. In the years since the settlement, he had started asking before deciding. Not every time. He was still the pragmatist, still the one who saw the machine, but he had added the column. Iris reviewed the legal compliance section and found 2 items that required attention. She presented them with her characteristic precision and without the edge that had once accompanied everything she said to Aaliyah. The edge was still there in other rooms, but not here. Nate brought chairs from his studio, 6 of them, the same design, pale oak, clean joints, for the dining room because the old chairs had begun to wobble and someone needed to do something about it. He had made them over the summer. He set them around the table without announcement, as if furniture that holds a family is just what you make when you have the skill and the people need it. June brought food, as she always did, and her husband brought her daughter, 11 months old, named Eleanor, called Ellie, who sat in a high chair at the end of the table and regarded the proceedings with the magnificent indifference of a person who has not yet learned to perform emotions she doesn't feel. The trust was sound. The farm was operating at a modest but sustainable profit. The lien on the eastern parcel had been fully retired the previous spring. The northern parcel where Nate's studio stood had been converted to a family use lease, generating a small annual payment that went into the trust's maintenance fund. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, as people gathered coats and packed up folders and Ellie fell asleep in her father's arms, Calloway walked over to where Aaliyah was standing near the window that looked out over the back porch, the porch swing, the oaks, and he said, "I know this isn't where you expected to be." She looked at him. "No," she said, "but I'm here by choice now. That's different." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she did not expect. "She would have liked you. My mother. She would have found you. I think she would have found you necessary. It was the closest he had ever come to saying what could not quite be said, that the woman his father had loved in the years after Eleanor was not a replacement, not a threat, not a problem to be managed, but a human being who had earned the right to stand in a room that had taken too long to make space for her. Aaliyah said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." And that was enough. Jed was at the meeting too. He sat at the table and he listened, and he spoke when he had something to contribute, and he stayed quiet when he didn't. He had aged in the 3 years since October. Not rapidly, but honestly, the way a man ages when he has decided to stop arguing with time. His hair was grayer. His face was more settled. After the meeting, he walked Aaliyah to her car. They stood in the gravel drive in the September evening, the oaks full and dark around them, the light on the fields. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am." He said, "Good." And they stood there for another moment, not with longing, not with resolution, but with the particular texture of a relationship that has survived its own worst version and is still deciding what it wants to be when the debris is cleared. The texture of two people who have earned each other's honesty and are not sure yet what to build with it. She drove back to her house on the quiet street with the magnolia in the front yard. She made tea. She sat on her porch in the September dark, and she listened to the town of Oakhaven doing what small towns do in the evening. Someone's screen door, a car on the main road, someone's porch light coming on. She thought about her mother's hands, about the quilt, about the composition books that now sat on a shelf in her living room, lined up in order, the record of 5 years of a life that had been more than it appeared and less than she'd been told. She thought, "I am a woman who is here," present tense, by choice. She thought, "I know what I cost. I know what I am worth. I know that those two numbers are not the same and never will be, and I have stopped apologizing for the difference." The tea cooled in her hands. The magnolia was dark and still. Somewhere, in the September air, there was the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. Not with Jed, not with the family, not with the homestead, but with herself. A beginning that had been available for 5 years and had required all 5 years of everything they contained to arrive at. She was Aaliyah Vance. She was 54 years old. She was a woman who had been named in a trust and told to sign something she didn't sign, and had walked into a courthouse in a good wool coat and her mother's earrings, and had not been moved. She was a woman who had loved imperfectly, and been loved imperfectly, and had held her own shape through both. She was, finally, at home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now, hit like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. It helps us keep sharing stories about strong women, families, and life's unexpected turns. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. See you in the next video.